The summer sun still burned over Albuquerque when 15-year-old Isabella Morales stepped out of her home near the Rio Grande with a backpack on her shoulder. What looked like a simple picnic turned into the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch for 17 years. By dusk, her family's Ford Ranger was discovered abandoned in a dusty lot, the door wide open, keys still in the ignition, her phone glowing silently on the passenger seat. That night, the riverbank filled with the beams of flashlights and the desperate voices of neighbors and officers calling her name. But the desert only gave back silence. What followed would shatter her family, haunt her community, and test the very limits of forensic science until the truth finally emerged almost 2 decades later. What happened to Isabella after she waved goodbye that summer morning in 2007, and how did a quiet man living an ordinary life manage to hide in plain sight for so long? If you want to uncover the answers to these questions, then like this video and subscribe to my channel Unscripted Tales, and make sure to turn on the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Also, tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story, and help us reach 5,000 likes so more people can know Isabella's story. On July 14th, 2007, the heat of the Southwest pressed down over Albuquerque. Windows along the streets were veiled with dust drifting from the Rio Grande basin. In a small home near the river, the Morales family prepared for a normal Saturday. Carmen, the mother, made breakfast while her daughter Isabella chatted with her brother Diego about a picnic she had been planning. Isabella, known to friends as Izzy, was bright and kind. Teachers admired her dedication. Friends loved her sense of humor and warmth. She dreamed of becoming a nurse one day and often filled sketchbooks with paintings. That morning she dressed simply in a mint green shirt and jeans, her long hair tied back, her woven bracelet snug around her wrist. She reassured her mother with a smile that she would be home before afternoon. Diego teased her for carrying too many snacks, but told her to call if anything felt wrong. With a quick hug, Isabella stepped into the family's Ford Ranger and drove off toward the Rio Grande Trail. For her mother, the last image was her daughter looking back with a radiant smile. Hours later, as the sun turned gold over the desert, that smile would become a memory her family would cling to for the rest of their lives. The morning of July 14th began like so many others in the Morales household. The desert sun had only just started to climb, spilling a warm glow through the curtains of their small home near the Rio Grande. Carmen Morales stood at the stove, the sound of sizzling eggs mixing with the faint hum of a radio on the counter. She moved carefully, as if balancing routine with a hidden weight in her chest that only mothers feel when they sense their children growing too quickly. At the kitchen table sat Isabella, 15 years old, full of quiet energy. She flipped through her sketchbook, lines of half-finished drawings scattered across the pages. Her brother Diego leaned back in his chair, tossing small jokes her way, laughing at how many snacks she had packed for what was meant to be just a simple picnic. She rolled her eyes at him, but her smile was wide and bright. To everyone around her, Isabella was the dependable one. A girl who studied hard, helped her mother, and dreamed of becoming a nurse someday. Friends said she carried light into every room she entered. Teachers described her as one of those rare students who could be serious and kind at the same time. That morning she wore her favorite mint green t-shirt, her jeans slightly faded, and her long dark hair pulled neatly back. On her wrist rested the colorful woven bracelet a classmate had given her. She moved through the house with a quiet confidence, reminding her mother she would be back well before evening. Carmen studied her daughter for a moment longer, as if trying to memorize the sight. Diego shook his head at her overflowing backpack, but reminded her to call if she needed anything. As Isabella stepped out to the driveway and climbed into the family's old Ford Ranger, she turned back one last time. Her smile glowed in the morning light as she waved. It was a small gesture, one that felt so ordinary in that moment, yet it would remain the final memory Carmen carried of her daughter alive. The sun climbed higher over Albuquerque, but inside the Morales home a quiet shadow was already beginning to form. a shadow that would grow darker with each hour that Isabella's seat at the table remained empty. What began as a bright morning of laughter and routine would soon twist into an evening of silence when calls went unanswered and the Ford Ranger was found abandoned by the Rio Grande. As the long summer day began to fade, the Morales home grew heavy with silence. The golden light of the late afternoon stretched across the walls, but Isabella's usual laughter was missing. Carmen dialed her daughter's phone again and again, each ring echoing in the air before falling into emptiness. Diego tried too, his voice sharp with unease, but every call went unanswered. The hours that once seemed ordinary began to feel unbearable. When the dinner table remained empty, Carmen's chest tightened with a weight she could not shake. Diego, restless and anxious, grabbed his keys and told his mother he would drive the familiar route toward the Rio Grande Trail. He hoped to spot her truck parked near the picnic area, to prove that worry had been for nothing. But as the desert sky deepened into shades of orange and purple, the uneasy truth began to unfold. Diego's headlights cut through the dusty road leading to the river. At a small deserted lot, he suddenly froze. There it was. The old Ford Ranger. Its door hung wide open. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat, Isabella's phone lit up with missed calls from her mother. The truck was untouched. No broken glass, no visible struggle. Just a chilling emptiness, as if Isabella had stepped out and simply vanished into the air. Diego's heart pounded as he stumbled back, hands shaking while he dialed 911. His voice trembled as he told the dispatcher what he had found. At home, Carmen collapsed to the floor when the call came. Neighbors soon gathered in the street, whispering in disbelief. Everyone knew Isabella had no reason to run away. The unanswered question settled over the community like a dark cloud. What should have been the end of an ordinary summer evening was now the beginning of a nightmare that would consume a family and a city. And when the flashing red and blue lights finally reached that lonely lot by the Rio Grande, the search for Isabella Morales began under the weight of dread and fear. Within an hour of Diego's call, patrol cars pulled into the lonely lot by the Rio Grande. Red and blue lights washed over the silent Ford Ranger. Officers stretched yellow tape across the area, flashlights sweeping through the dust. Portable halogen lamps were set up, flooding the desert night with an eerie glow. The vehicle was studied carefully, keys still in the ignition, phone on the passenger seat. No signs of blood, no signs of forced entry, just an abandoned truck that now felt like a doorway into something darker. Search teams moved quickly into formation. Some officers spread along the riverbank, their beams flickering across water and brush. Others pushed into tangled trails, boots crunching over dry leaves. K9 units were brought in, the dogs pulling eagerly, noses close to the ground, barking at scents that led nowhere. A few spots were marked and flagged, but each turned out to be nothing more than scraps of old clothing or discarded bottles left behind by strangers. Above them, the steady hum of helicopter blades cut across the silence. Infrared cameras scanned the darkness, sending back blurred heat signatures. Each glowing shape raised hope, only to collapse into disappointment when ground teams reached the spot and found coyotes or rabbits darting through the brush. By midnight, volunteers had begun to arrive, first neighbors, then classmates, then entire families carrying flashlights. They fanned out across the dust, moving shoulder to shoulder in lines. Their voices called Isabella's name into the emptiness. Some of her school friends whispered through tears while their lights shook in trembling hands. Diego walked among them, throat raw from calling, heart aching as the desert wind carried his voice into silence. The night deepened, but the search did not stop. The beams of flashlights shimmered across the dark riverbank like restless fireflies, as if the entire community was holding on to a fragile hope that Isabella might still answer their call. As the hours dragged toward dawn, even seasoned officers knew that with every moment passing, the chance of finding Isabella alive was slipping further away. And when the first faint light began to creep over the Sandia Mountains, a discovery in a nearby arroyo would bring the search to a heartbreaking end. The night dragged on with no sign of Isabella. Along the Rio Grande, beams of light moved endlessly across water, brush, and dirt paths. They flickered like restless fireflies scattered across the darkness, never settling on the one thing everyone prayed to find. The sounds of barking dogs, crunching footsteps, and crackling radios filled the desert air, but there was still no answer. Hours passed, yet the search never slowed. Every bush was pushed aside, every shadow studied. The air carried both desperation and exhaustion. Some volunteers whispered prayers as they walked, while others held back tears, refusing to admit that hope was slipping away with each hour. At the command post, technicians pored over traffic and security footage gathered from the area. Screens played grainy black and white images again and again. One clip showed Isabella's Ford Ranger entering the parking lot that afternoon. The truck drove in alone. No cars followed. No suspicious figures stepped into frame. Seconds later, the screen went dark. That was the last confirmed image of Isabella. No exit, no stranger, nothing to explain what had happened once she left her vehicle. The night grew colder, but the searchers pressed on. Along the riverbank, the pale glow of flashlights stretched across the water, swaying with each step of the searchers. Overhead, the helicopter circled, its floodlight sweeping like a watchful eye across the desert. Yet each pass revealed only silence. For the Morales family, the wait at home was unbearable. Carmen sat slumped in a chair, her phone pressed to her chest, leaving voicemail after voicemail for a daughter who could no longer answer. Diego refused to stop, his voice breaking as he called out into the darkness. The community, once so full of ordinary summer life, now walked together under the heavy weight of fear. As the hours edged closer to dawn, exhaustion was written across every face. The light of morning would soon reveal what the night had hidden, and in a dry arroyo not far from the lot, a discovery was waiting to break the hearts of all who searched. When the first pale light of dawn crept over the Sandia Mountains, the searchers were worn down but unwilling to stop. Their flashlights dimmed in the growing daylight, yet their eyes stayed sharp, scanning every bush, every bend of the trail. Hope was fading, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Around 8 in the morning, a group of volunteers moved along a dry arroyo less than 2 miles from the parking lot. The sandy bed was quiet, the kind of place most people would pass without notice. Then someone saw it. Odd, dragged patterns across the smooth sand as if something heavy had been pulled. Hearts pounded as they called the officers over. Within minutes, the area was sealed with yellow tape. The crowd pushed back, silence settling in as investigators stepped forward. There, half buried in damp sand from a rain 2 days earlier, lay the small body of a girl, face down, her long dark hair tangled and matted. Her mint green shirt was pulled from one shoulder, her jeans coated with dirt. Scratches marked her arms and hands, her fingernails broken as if she had fought desperately until the end. Around her wrists and knees, bruises revealed the cruel truth that she had been forced down. The sand around her carried even more clues. Long drag marks led toward the arroyo, telling the story of a struggle. Just a few feet away, investigators found a single deep shoe print, much larger than Isabella's own foot. They photographed it, measured it, and marked it for evidence. Nearby, a scrap of dark fabric clung to a low branch, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It was carefully removed with tweezers, sealed in a bag, and labeled. The scene was unbearable. A young forensic technician broke down in tears when he noticed the woven bracelet on Isabella's wrist, the one her classmate had given her. Officers exchanged heavy looks. Some turned away, unable to watch as the body was lifted. Volunteers who had spent the night searching lowered their heads in silence, while Carmen and Diego, brought to the edge of the scene, collapsed in grief at the confirmation of their worst fears. Though the pain was overwhelming, investigators stayed focused. The drag marks, the bruises, the broken nails, and the sand filling Isabella's mouth and nose pointed to one horrifying possibility. She had been forced face down into the ground, suffocated in the dirt until her lungs could no longer fight for air. And while the coroner's van carried her away under the punishing sun, The air was thick with one question that echoed louder than all the silence around them. Who had done this, and why target a 15-year-old girl who only wanted to enjoy a picnic by the river? At the Albuquerque coroner's office, the sterile glow of white lights replaced the desert sun. The room was silent except for the ticking of a wall clock as Dr. Harold Kim and his team prepared for one of the most critical examinations of their careers. The body of 15-year-old Isabella Morales lay covered on the table, fragile and still, the weight of an entire community's hope resting on what evidence her final moments had left behind. The white sheet was pulled back, and the team began their work with practiced care. Every mark was photographed, every bruise measured, every injury documented. Scratches along her arms told the story of a struggle. Her fingernails were broken and jagged, clinging to small fragments of foreign material that could only have come from her attacker. These traces were carefully scraped and sealed in sterile containers, preserved for DNA analysis. When lung samples were examined, the truth became undeniable. Fine grains of sand and traces of organic matter from the arroyo bed filled the tissue. Isabella had been alive when her face was forced into the ground, inhaling mud and grit until her lungs could no longer fight. This was not an accident. It was homicide, confirmed beyond doubt. The bruises around her wrists and knees revealed how she had been held down. Patterns suggested a tight grip, hands pressing into skin, cutting off circulation. Her clothing carried further evidence. The mint green t-shirt bore a tear near the shoulder, while her jeans were streaked with dirt and frayed fibers from violent movement. Each item was bagged separately, fibers and residues preserved for later testing. Even the bracelet on her wrist, bright with woven threads, was removed and stored, because even the smallest detail could hold the truth. Dr. Kim wrote his preliminary report with steady precision. Cause of death, mechanical asphyxiation by suffocation. Manner of death, homicide. No sexual assault was present, but there was undeniable evidence of restraint, resistance, and violent struggle. The most vital note of all was this: foreign DNA under Isabella's fingernails, evidence that could one day name her killer. When the report reached investigators, silence fell in the room. The case was no longer a missing person. It was a brutal murder. And while Isabella's family grieved at the confirmation of their darkest fear, the question now turned to who among them, who in their city, had left their mark beneath her nails. When the preliminary autopsy findings reached the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, the atmosphere shifted instantly. What had begun as a desperate search for a missing teenager was now confirmed as a homicide investigation. The sheriff gathered his team, his voice heavy but firm, declaring that this case would take top priority. Every officer was reminded that the details preserved by Isabella herself, the DNA beneath her fingernails, could hold the key to everything. The Morales family was notified formally. In a small meeting room, Carmen and Diego sat across from investigators as the words were delivered with clinical precision. Isabella had been suffocated, forced face down into the ground. She had fought hard. The broken nails and bruises proved it. For Carmen, those words landed like sharp blades, each one carving deeper into her grief. She collapsed into sobs, unable to hold her body upright. Diego froze in silence, staring at the report, gripping it so tightly his knuckles whitened. He whispered only one thought again and again. The DNA under her nails will tell us who did this. By the following morning, the news spread across Albuquerque. Headlines screamed that the death of 15-year-old Isabella Morales had been ruled a murder. The community, already shaken by her disappearance, now felt the icy grip of fear. Parents pulled their children closer. Neighbors locked their doors earlier, and conversations in grocery stores and parks circled back to one name. Isabella. Television anchors spoke solemnly. Reporters replayed the grainy footage of her truck entering the lot, the last known trace of her alive. The public was told that DNA evidence had been collected and was being processed, raising hope that a suspect might be identified quickly. But those closest to the investigation knew the truth. DNA testing in 2007 was powerful, but it was not yet as advanced as the science of later years. Still, they clung to the belief that Isabella had fought for her life, and in doing so had carried a piece of her killer with her. The city waited, restless and afraid, as officers prepared to expand their investigation, and with eyes now turning toward those closest to Isabella, the first suspects would soon face the harsh light of interrogation. With the case now elevated to top priority, investigators turned first to the people who had once been close to Isabella. The hope was that answers would be found quickly, perhaps within the circle of familiarity. The first to be questioned was Miguel Alvarez, Isabella's ex-boyfriend, only a year older than her. Their relationship had been brief and ended quietly, but detectives knew they could not ignore someone who had once been close to her life. In the interrogation room, Miguel insisted that on the day Isabella vanished, he was playing basketball with friends at a park 10 miles away. His teammates confirmed his story, and grainy footage from a security camera at the park showed him on the court that afternoon. His DNA was also tested against the sample found under Isabella's fingernails. It did not match. Miguel was cleared, but the whispers in the community left scars. His family endured suspicious stares, and the weight of being suspected pushed him to transfer schools, carrying the silent burden of being connected to a tragedy he did not cause. Investigators then turned their focus closer to the Morales neighborhood. A man named Carl Benson, a bachelor who lived 3 houses down, had often been noticed walking along the Rio Grande. Some neighbors whispered about how he sometimes lingered near parks where students gathered. Questioned by detectives, Benson said he had been at home on the evening of July 14th watching a baseball game on television. No one directly witnessed his alibi, but his phone record showed he had called a ticket hotline during the game. His DNA was tested as well. It did not match. Though cleared officially, suspicion lingered in the neighborhood, and Benson soon lived under a cloud of gossip that would never fully fade. The most troubling figure to investigators was Richard Gutierrez, a man with a record of harassment from several years earlier. In 2003, he had been arrested for following a female student near downtown Albuquerque, though charges never stuck. When questioned about July 14th, Gutierrez stumbled. At first he said he had been home, then changed his story to visiting a friend in South Valley. The contradictions raised immediate red flags. Detectives searched his apartment, seizing a pair of shoes that seemed to resemble the print left in the arroyo. His DNA was tested. The community buzzed with rumors that he was the one, and even local media suggested he might be responsible. But when the lab results arrived, his DNA did not match the evidence under Isabella's nails. The shoes, though close in size, had a completely different sole pattern. Gutierrez was released. The community's disappointment was sharp, and many felt betrayed by investigators who had publicly tied a man to the case, only to let him walk free. Other men surfaced, including a security guard who worked the night shift at an industrial park near the lot. Another driver was reported as circling the parking area that afternoon. Each was questioned, tested, and eventually cleared. The cycle became familiar. A name would rise, a lead would grow, DNA would be tested, and headlines would declare another dead end. Each release deepened the frustration in Albuquerque. Parents grew fearful, teenagers grew restless, and the community's patience began to unravel. For every suspect cleared, one truth remained stronger than ever. The DNA beneath Isabella's nails had spoken, but the killer's name was still hidden, and with each false lead, the trust between the community and the investigators began to fracture, creating a tension that would only grow heavier with time. As weeks turned into months, the people of Albuquerque grew restless. Town halls were held in crowded school gyms and community centers, parents clutching their children tightly as they demanded answers from law enforcement. Voices rose in anger, questions flew, and each time investigators repeated the same line. The case remained open, leads were being pursued, DNA testing was ongoing, but to the families in those rooms, it all sounded like delay, like excuses, like silence wrapped in official words. Parental fear began to take hold across the city. Children were no longer allowed to walk home from school alone. Parks that once filled with laughter stood empty in the evenings. The Rio Grande Trail, once a popular spot for picnics and fishing, became a place people drove past quickly, avoiding the lot where Isabella's Ford Ranger had been found. Whispers spread that the killer might still be walking freely among them, blending into everyday life unseen and unpunished. For the Morales family, grief dug deeper with each passing day. Carmen barely left her home, her body weakened by sorrow, her voice often breaking when she tried to speak her daughter's name. She refused to move Isabella's belongings, leaving her room exactly as it had been the morning she left. The bed remained neatly made, her sketchbook left open on the desk, the pages filled with unfinished drawings. For Carmen, it was both a shrine and a wound that never closed. Diego carried his pain differently. He pushed through the frustration and clung to one truth with every ounce of strength he had left. The DNA beneath Isabella's fingernails was not just evidence. It was her final act of defiance, her way of reaching out from beyond to name the man who had taken her life. He reminded himself again and again that science would one day catch up, that justice might move slowly but it could not be stopped. But the longer the case dragged with no answers, the sharper the divide grew between the community and law enforcement, and in the midst of doubt and anger, the investigation quietly began to fade from the headlines, slipping toward a cold silence that would stretch for years. The file grew thicker with reports and interviews, yet the killer's name remained absent, leaving behind a question that haunted every parent, every neighbor, and every member of Isabella's family. Who had left their trace under her nails, and how long would it take for the truth to be revealed? By the summer of 2010, 3 years had passed since the night Isabella vanished and was found in the arroyo. The DNA beneath her fingernails had been tested again and again, compared against every profile in CODIS, the national database. Each time the result was the same, no match. Investigators held on to the sample like a lifeline, but without a name to connect it to. The trail grew colder with every passing month. Gradually, resources began to slip away. Detectives who once worked the case full-time were reassigned to other investigations. The command post that once buzzed with energy now sat quiet, files stacked neatly but rarely touched. For the Morales family, the silence from law enforcement felt like abandonment. The promise that Isabella's killer would be caught seemed to fade into little more than a distant echo. Yet the community tried not to forget. Each year, on the anniversary of Isabella's disappearance, candles flickered in Old Town Plaza. Friends, teachers, and neighbors gathered with photos of the smiling 15-year-old, voices trembling as they prayed for justice. But as the years went on, fewer people came. The crowd that once filled the square slowly dwindled, leaving only the most devoted to stand with Carmen and Diego as the evenings grew colder and the hope dimmer. Inside the Morales home, time stood still. Carmen refused to change her daughter's room. The bed remained made, the mint green t-shirt folded neatly on the chair, the sketchbook resting on the desk as if waiting for Isabella to return and finish the drawings. For Carmen, stepping into that room was like stepping into a memory that never aged. She could not let go, and she would not let go. Diego carried the weight in his own way. He had been preparing for college, dreaming of becoming a teacher, but when his mother's grief became too heavy to bear alone, he placed his future on hold. He stayed home, working part-time and caring for her, holding tightly to the belief that someday the DNA would deliver the answer they had been waiting for. He told himself that Isabella's final act, her fight, had not been in vain. But as the years slipped by, the case file thickened while the trail itself froze. What had once burned brightly on every front page now sat in the shadows of unsolved crimes. And though the family's pain never lessened, the investigation stood at a standstill, waiting for a breakthrough that seemed impossibly far away. Then, almost a decade later, a spark of new technology would rise, breathing life into a case everyone thought had been left behind. By 2012, 5 years after Isabella's murder, the official case sat mostly silent. Files gathered dust in the sheriff's office, and the family felt the sting of being forgotten. Desperate for answers, Carmen and Diego pooled what little money they had to hire a private investigator. His name was James Holloway, a retired detective with a reputation for persistence and a deep voice that carried quiet authority. Holloway began by taking the thick stack of reports home, spreading them across his dining table, reading every line until dawn. He retraced the steps of the original search, revisiting the arroyo where Isabella had been found. He knocked on doors across the Morales neighborhood, speaking with old neighbors who had long since stopped receiving visits from police. Some remembered details they had never shared. Others simply shook their heads, weary of a case that had dragged on with no justice. One story that surfaced again and again was of a silver pickup truck seen near the Rio Grande lot on the day Isabella vanished. A pair of teenagers swore they had noticed it circling slowly, though they disagreed on the time. Another man said he saw a similar truck parked near the trail but could not recall if it was before or after sunset. The memories clashed, blurred by the years, and each retelling left Holloway with more questions than answers. He tried to track down registrations for vehicles that matched, but none of the names connected to the DNA or matched the timelines. The silver pickup became another ghost in a case already filled with shadows. For months, Holloway pressed forward, chasing every rumor, calling old witnesses, and combing through evidence lists. But each lead ended the same way. No match, no suspect, no justice. Eventually the money ran out. Holloway sat across from Carmen and Diego one final time, his voice heavy as he admitted he had gone as far as he could. He packed his notes into a box and stepped away from the case. The family was left with the silence again. The same silence that had haunted them since 2007. Carmen felt abandoned all over again. Her trust broken not only by the system, but now by the man she had believed might deliver what the police could not. Diego clenched his fists, repeating to himself that the DNA was still there, waiting to speak when the right time came. But as years continued to slip away, the case sank deeper into the shadows, leaving behind only a grieving family and a fading memory of a girl who had once smiled so brightly. Then, in 2019, when almost all hope had vanished, science took a leap forward that would change the course of Isabella's case forever. By 2019, 12 long years had passed since Isabella's murder. The case file was thick, the evidence carefully stored, but hope had grown thin. That year, however, the Bernalillo County Cold Case Unit received new support from the FBI. A new forensic tool was now available, something far more advanced than the DNA testing of 2007. It was called next-generation sequencing, a method that could unlock genetic details once invisible to older technology. The decision was made with quiet determination. Evidence from Isabella's case, including the scrapings from beneath her fingernails, was carefully retrieved from storage. Technicians handled the containers with the same care as if they were sacred artifacts, because in many ways they were. They represented Isabella's final fight, her final chance to speak. The samples were shipped under secure chain of custody to an FBI lab equipped with the new sequencing tools. Weeks later, the results arrived. The analysis revealed a detailed genetic profile far richer than the old methods had ever produced. Investigators leaned forward in anticipation as the data was compared against CODIS once again. But the result was the same, no match. The name they needed was still not in the system. The air in the room seemed to collapse under the weight of disappointment. For Carmen and Diego, who had waited more than a decade, the news was like watching a door open only to slam shut again. Yet the FBI agents were not discouraged. Quietly in that meeting, another possibility was raised. If CODIS could not provide a name, there was a different path. A method that had recently solved cases once thought impossible. Investigative genetic genealogy. By comparing Isabella's killer's DNA to public genealogical databases, distant relatives could be identified, and from there, family trees could be built backward and forward until a suspect emerged. It was complex, it was slow, and it required court approval, but it was a light in a case that had known only shadows for years. For the first time in over a decade, investigators felt something stir. The technology had caught up with Isabella's final act of defiance. Her fingernails had held on to the truth. Now, science was closer than ever to giving her a voice, and as whispers of genealogy spread through the investigation team, the possibility of finally unmasking the man who had hidden in plain sight became more real than anyone dared to believe. The decision to pursue genetic genealogy required more than hope. It required the approval of the court. Privacy laws were strict, and the method was still new, still controversial. In early 2020, detectives and FBI agents stood before a judge in a quiet Albuquerque courtroom. They explained that the DNA beneath Isabella's fingernails had never matched any profile in CODIS, but that a genealogical search could identify distant relatives of the killer. The judge listened carefully, weighing the risks and protections. After hours of testimony, he granted a narrowly scoped order. The search would be allowed, but with strict safeguards. Only distant matches would be examined, and the work would remain focused solely on the Morales case. The sample was uploaded into GED Match, one of the largest public databases used by genealogy enthusiasts. For days, investigators watched the screens, waiting for the system to respond. Then at last a single connection appeared. A distant cousin in Texas. It was not a direct lead, but it was a beginning. From that thread, genealogists began building a family tree, branch by branch, name by name. The work stretched across state lines. Birth certificates, marriage records, and obituaries were pulled from archives. Families were traced backward into grandparents and great-grandparents, then forward into living descendants. With each branch, the possibilities narrowed. The team of genealogists worked with precision, marking off those who were too young, too old, or living far away at the time of Isabella's death. Slowly, the pool of names shrank, from hundreds to dozens to only a handful. For the first time, investigators were not searching blindly. They were looking at a list of real people who could not ignore the weight of genetics tying them to the crime. Somewhere within that small pool of names was the man Isabella had fought on that terrible summer evening. And as detectives turned their focus toward one name in particular, the trail that had been cold for more than a decade was about to ignite with new fire. From the family tree built through genealogical records, one name began to stand out. Miguel Herrera. At first glance, he seemed like an unlikely suspect. A man in his early 30s at the time of Isabella's death. He had no serious criminal record, no arrests for violence, no public history that suggested danger. He had built what looked like an ordinary life. Married, children, steady work. Yet when investigators dug deeper, the cracks in that surface began to show. In 2007, the very year Isabella was killed, Miguel Herrera had been employed with a railroad maintenance crew. His work often placed him near the Rio Grande corridors, sometimes within sight of the very trails Isabella would have walked that summer day. That connection alone made detectives pause, but what struck them even more was what happened after. Within months of Isabella's murder, Herrera abruptly left Albuquerque. He moved south to Las Cruces with little explanation, taking a job that kept him away from the city where suspicion might grow. The genealogical link was only one part of the puzzle, but other details began to add weight. Witnesses who had been re-interviewed recalled a silver pickup truck circling near the lot where Isabella's Ford Ranger was found. At the time, the lead had gone nowhere. Now records showed Herrera had owned a silver pickup in 2007. The vehicle was later sold, leaving no trace but the memory of its presence lined up too closely to ignore. Other names on the genealogical list were gradually eliminated. Some were out of state in 2007. Others were minors at the time. Others produced DNA samples that cleared them. Each strikeout left Miguel Herrera standing more firmly in the spotlight. To investigators, the contrast was unsettling. Here was a man who had managed to keep his record clean, who raised a family, who built a quiet life that shielded him from suspicion, and yet, hidden in his past, lay the shadow of Isabella Morales. The more detectives studied his history, the more they realized that Miguel Herrera had not vanished into the background of the city. He had hidden in plain sight, carrying the secret of what happened on that summer evening in 2007. And soon, investigators would begin watching him closely, waiting for the chance to collect the one piece of proof that could bring his mask crashing down. Once Miguel Herrera's name rose to the top of the list, investigators knew they had to move carefully. A single mistake could tip him off and close the door on a case that had waited 12 years for justice. In the fall of 2019, a quiet surveillance operation was launched in Las Cruces, where Herrera now lived with his family. Unmarked vehicles parked at a distance, agents rotating shifts to watch his every move. They documented his daily routine with precision, noting his stops for groceries, his commute to work, his evenings at home. For weeks they waited patiently, searching for a chance to gather something he touched and discarded in public. It had to be legal, it had to be uncontaminated, and it had to be done without him knowing. The break came one Saturday afternoon. Herrera stopped at a small convenience store, bought a pack of beer, and lingered outside by his truck. As he finished one can, he crushed it in his hand and tossed it into a public trash bin. Minutes later, he wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and threw that away too. When he drove off, agents moved quickly. The bin was seized, the items carefully bagged, gloves and masks ensuring nothing interfered with the evidence. The can and napkin were rushed under secure chain of custody to the state forensic lab. Every person in the investigation felt the weight of what was about to happen. Technicians worked through the night, extracting DNA from the saliva left on the napkin and the rim of the can. Then came the moment of truth. The fresh profile was compared against the sample taken from beneath Isabella's fingernails in 2007. Computers ran the sequences side by side, every strand, every marker, every code checked with absolute precision. When the final result appeared on the screen, the room fell silent. It was a perfect match. The same man whose DNA Isabella had carried in her last desperate fight was the man who now lived quietly in Las Cruces, under the name Miguel Herrera. For the first time in over a decade, investigators had undeniable proof. Isabella's killer had been found, and as the weight of that truth settled in, the question became how to confront the man who had kept this secret for so long without giving him the chance to escape justice. By June of 2024, the long wait for certainty was finally over. The lab confirmed what investigators already felt in their bones. The DNA recovered from the beer can and napkin taken in Las Cruces matched perfectly with the DNA found under Isabella's fingernails in 2007. The probability of error was so small it could not be measured. The killer had been identified. His name was Miguel Herrera. Inside the task force office, the weight of 17 years lifted in a quiet, almost reverent silence. Some investigators lowered their heads. Others released long-held breaths, and a few allowed themselves to close their eyes for a moment. It was not celebration. It was release. Isabella had finally spoken through the evidence she left behind, and her voice had been heard. That afternoon, detectives made their way to the Morales home. Carmen and Diego sat at the kitchen table where so many tears had been shed. They listened as the lead investigator explained in steady words that a perfect DNA match had been found. Isabella's killer had been living quietly in New Mexico all these years. For Carmen, the news was a storm of emotions. Relief that her daughter's fight had not been in vain, anguish that the answer had taken nearly 2 decades, and anger that the man who had taken Isabella's life had been free for so long. Diego gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His voice cracked as he whispered that Isabella had finally been proven right, that her struggle had carried the truth forward. When the news reached the public, Albuquerque trembled. 17 years of whispers, rumors, and false leads came crashing down in a single headline. The name Miguel Herrera was repeated on television screens, in newspapers, and across social media. Parents who had once walked the candlelight vigils now sat stunned, realizing the man responsible had lived undetected for so long. Reporters called it a seismic update, a revelation that shattered the illusion of safety the community had tried to rebuild. But even as the truth came into focus, another question grew heavier. How would Herrera react when he realized the net of justice was closing around him? With the DNA match secured, investigators knew their next step had to be careful and deliberate. They could not storm Miguel Herrera's home without a warrant. They needed to observe him, test his reactions, and create the opportunity for a formal summons. So on a quiet July morning, a team of plain-clothed officers drove to his modest single-story house in Las Cruces. The desert air was still cool, the street almost empty as they walked to his door. When Herrera opened it, his face carried a practiced calm, but his hands betrayed him. They gripped the frame so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. He asked what this was about, his voice steady at first but rising slightly at the edges. The lead investigator explained they were reopening an old case from Albuquerque and wanted to speak with him. For a moment his eyes flickered, and then he forced a faint smile and invited them in. The living room was simple. A family photo hung on the wall, his children smiling brightly in Christmas sweaters. That warmth contrasted sharply with the tension that filled the room. When asked about 2007, Herrera admitted he had lived in Albuquerque for a few months working on the railroad. But when pressed on July 14th, the day Isabella disappeared, his words stumbled. He claimed he had been home, then quickly corrected himself, saying he could not remember clearly. His contradictions were noted in silence. At one point he asked to step outside for a cigarette to calm his nerves. He smoked quickly, exhaling sharp bursts of smoke, then tossed the cigarette to the ground before returning inside. An agent casually retrieved it moments later, sealing it as fresh DNA evidence. By the time the conversation ended, Herrera was visibly shaken. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the air conditioner humming softly. His answers had grown shorter, his eyes darting away from the investigator's gaze. Before leaving, the team handed him a formal summons to appear at the FBI office in Santa Fe for questioning. He hesitated, then nodded stiffly, agreeing to comply. That night his neighbors noticed something unusual. Herrera, normally reserved and steady, paced his yard alone, chain smoking under the dim glow of a porch light. His calm facade was cracking, and investigators watching from a distance knew the moment of confrontation was drawing near. But what would happen when Herrera sat face to face with investigators, with the truth laid bare before him? On the morning of July 12th, Miguel Herrera walked into the FBI office in Santa Fe, under the watchful eyes of agents who had tracked his every move for weeks. He arrived alone, leaving his belongings at the front desk, before being led into a stark interrogation room. The walls were bare, the overhead lights sharp, and the cold steel table separated him from three investigators who had prepared for this moment for years. At first, the tone was calm, almost conversational. They asked about his time in Albuquerque in 2007, about the railroad work, about the routes he had driven along the Rio Grande. Herrera answered cautiously, his words clipped and rehearsed. He admitted being in the city, but insisted he remembered little about that summer. When pressed about July 14th, the day Isabella vanished, his gaze fell to the table. His answers wavered, shifting from vague memories to contradictions. Then the atmosphere shifted. An agent slid a thick folder across the table. Inside was the DNA report. The beer can and napkin he had discarded matched perfectly with the DNA under Isabella's nails. It was not partial, not close, but an absolute confirmation. As the words were spoken, Herrera's composure cracked. His lips curled into a dry laugh, trembling as he accused the investigators of tampering with his trash. He claimed the evidence was contaminated, that someone could have stolen something of his. But even as he spoke, his voice shook. His hands tapped nervously on the table and sweat rolled down his face. The questions sharpened. Why was his DNA under the fingernails of a murdered 15-year-old girl? Why did a witness remember a silver pickup near the Rio Grande lot in the very hours Isabella disappeared? Why did he leave Albuquerque abruptly after her death? Herrera had no clear answers. His excuses faltered. His body betrayed him. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting toward the door, his breathing quick and uneven. Finally, his voice cracked as he demanded a lawyer. He refused to answer further questions. The interrogation ended without a confession, but the silence spoke louder than any words could. As he was escorted out, investigators exchanged heavy glances. They had the science, the circumstances, and the unraveling mask of a guilty man. What they lacked was his admission. That night, as he returned to his home in Las Cruces, Herrera sat in darkness while agents outside kept silent watch. He had left the room without confessing, but his crumbling facade suggested that his next move might reveal even more than his words ever could. The morning after his interrogation in Santa Fe, the quiet street in Las Cruces was shattered. Miguel Herrera's wife awoke to find the garage door ajar. Inside, the smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. Herrera lay lifeless on the concrete floor beside a handgun. On a nearby table, a short handwritten note offered nothing but a vague apology to his wife and children. There was no mention of Isabella, no acknowledgement of what he had done. Police quickly arrived, confirming there were no signs of struggle. His weapon was legally registered, and his death was ruled a suicide. News traveled swiftly through the neighborhood. Residents who had once described Herrera as a polite, quiet man stood outside in disbelief. Some whispered that they had lived beside a killer without ever knowing it. Others shook their heads, refusing to believe the man who nodded good morning at church could have been capable of such violence. At the Morales home, the news landed like a fresh wound. Carmen broke into uncontrollable sobs, her voice trembling as she cried that he had stolen the truth along with her daughter's life. She had hoped for a trial, for answers, for the chance to look into his eyes and ask why. Now that hope was gone forever. Diego's fury was sharper. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting that Herrera had escaped again. He had lived freely for 17 years and then chosen his own ending instead of facing justice. Across Albuquerque, the community felt a strange mix of relief and bitterness. Relief that the killer had been identified beyond doubt. Bitterness that there would never be a courtroom reckoning. No testimony, no confession, no chance for the Morales family to hear him admit his crime. In Las Cruces, Herrera's wife and children faced their own storm of grief and disbelief. To them, he had been a loving husband and father. Now they were left to grapple with the truth that the man they loved had hidden a monstrous secret. The case had finally revealed its killer, but with his death came a void. The question of why he chose Isabella, and whether there were other shadows buried in his past, remained unanswered. Even after Miguel Herrera's death, investigators knew they had to be absolutely certain before declaring the case closed. In the days that followed his suicide, forensic teams worked quickly but methodically. Samples from his autopsy were collected and compared against the DNA found under Isabella's fingernails. Multiple tests were performed, each one designed to erase every doubt. The results spoke with undeniable clarity. Standard STR testing confirmed the match. ISTR testing, which focuses on paternal lines, narrowed it even further. Next-generation sequencing, the same advanced method that had reignited the case in 2019, left no room for uncertainty. Statisticians calculated the odds of error at less than 1 in several trillion. Science had settled the question. Miguel Herrera was the man Isabella Morales had fought against on that summer evening in 2007. With the evidence fully verified, The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office and the FBI scheduled a joint press conference. Cameras lined the room, reporters filled the seats, and the community that had waited 17 years for closure listened in silence. The lead investigator stepped to the podium, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the announcement. Miguel Herrera was officially named as the offender in the murder of Isabella Morales. The case, after nearly 2 decades, was declared closed. The words rippled through Albuquerque like a cold wind. For some, it was the relief of finally knowing. For others, it was the sting of knowing justice would never play out in a courtroom. For Carmen and Diego, the announcement was both an ending and a wound that would never fully heal. They had carried Isabella's memory through years of silence, false leads, and fading hope. Now they carried the truth, but not the answers they had longed for. The case was closed on paper, but in the hearts of many, one question remained. How could a man who lived so quietly for so many years hide such a dark secret without anyone ever seeing it? When the case was officially declared closed, the Morales family stepped forward to speak publicly. The press conference had already carried the weight of finality, but it was Carmen and Diego's words that truly echoed through the room. Carmen stood at the podium first, her hands trembling as she clutched a photograph of Isabella. Her voice was soft but clear. She thanked the investigators who had never given up, the community who had lit candles year after year, and the technology that had finally uncovered the truth. Then her tone shifted, filled with sorrow. Justice, she said, had come too late. Too late for her daughter. Too late for her family. Too late to hold the man accountable in a court of law. Her eyes filled with tears as she said that all she ever wanted was to hear the word guilty spoken aloud in a courtroom. But now that chance had been stolen forever. When Carmen stepped back, Diego took her place. His words were sharper, carried with the fire of anger that had burned inside him for 17 years. He spoke of the endless delays, the failed leads, the resources pulled away when the case went cold. He said his sister's killer had lived free for nearly 2 decades, raising his own children while their family was left broken. He said Isabella had been denied justice twice, once in 2007 and again when Miguel Herrera chose his own escape. The room was heavy with silence until the last words were spoken. Then applause broke out. It was not the applause of celebration, but of respect, of shared grief, of relief that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Reporters lowered their cameras, community members wiped their eyes, and for a brief moment everyone in that room carried the weight together. Yet even as the words faded, one thought lingered. What did the 17 years of silence reveal about the flaws in a system meant to protect? And how many other families still wait for the answers that may never come? Even after Miguel Herrera was named as Isabella's killer, investigators could not shake the feeling that his story might not end there. He had worked years on railroad maintenance crews, traveling across state lines, moving quietly from town to town along the Rio Grande corridors and beyond. Railroads cut through deserts, small towns, and lonely stretches of road where disappearances could remain unnoticed for years. The FBI began to ask a chilling question. Was Isabella the only victim? Case files from New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and Colorado were pulled from shelves and placed back under review. Unsolved murders, missing persons near rail yards, and assaults that had gone cold were spread across tables. Analysts compared timelines of Herrera's employment records against the dates of crimes. They searched for patterns in geography, in victim profiles, in the details of restraint or suffocation. For weeks the work grew heavier, each file hinting at possibilities. In some cases the method of attack felt eerily similar. In others the victims had last been seen near railroad trails or isolated lots that matched Herrera's work sites. Yet despite the unsettling overlaps, no direct forensic links had been confirmed. Without DNA or witnesses, suspicion remained speculation. The fear lingered, though. If Herrera had managed to hide one crime for nearly 2 decades, could there have been others hidden along the endless tracks he traveled? Communities across those states watched closely, parents holding their children tighter as headlines resurfaced. Old cases long forgotten. For the Morales family, the thought was unbearable. If Herrera had harmed others, then Isabella's death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger shadow stretching far beyond Albuquerque. And as investigators dug deeper into the ripple effect of one man's secret life, the haunting possibility remained that more stories like Isabella's might still be waiting to be uncovered. In September of 2024, the courthouse in Albuquerque filled with a different kind of trial. Not one of guilt or innocence, for Miguel Herrera was already gone, but of affirmation and accountability. A special public hearing was held where prosecutors, investigators, and FBI representatives laid out the case in full. Charts of DNA matches, timelines, and photographs of evidence were displayed for the record. The judge read the confirmation aloud. The science was irrefutable. Miguel Herrera had murdered Isabella Morales. The courtroom, silent until that moment, erupted in heavy breaths, muffled sobs, and quiet nods. The case was closed, but the community needed to hear the truth spoken plainly within the walls of justice. Yet as closure was offered, reckoning followed. Members of the public stepped forward to question why it had taken 17 years for justice to arrive. Parents demanded answers about the early days of the investigation, when leads were missed and resources were withdrawn. Advocates pointed out that if forensic genealogy had been available sooner, Herrera might have been caught before he ended his life. Officials listened, their shoulders heavy, admitting the painful truth. The system had limits, mistakes were made, and lessons had to be learned. It was a moment of humility in a city that had carried too much silence for too long. As night fell, the courthouse steps glowed with candlelight. Hundreds gathered, holding photographs of Isabella, their faces illuminated by the flames. Carmen and Diego stood at the front, their hands joined tightly as the crowd pledged to never let Isabella's name fade. Songs rose softly into the night, prayers whispered into the September air, and a vow echoed through the gathering. Her story would be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a reminder of the importance of persistence, truth, and community. And as the candles flickered in the dark, one question still lingered quietly in the minds of many. What does it mean for a community to heal when justice arrives too late? After the public hearing and candlelight vigil, Isabella's story spread far beyond Albuquerque. National media outlets picked it up, telling viewers about the girl whose fight had left behind the DNA that finally unmasked her killer 17 years later. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to the case, dissecting each twist, each failure, and the final breakthrough with forensic genealogy. Documentary filmmakers arrived in New Mexico, interviewing investigators, community members, and the Morales family, determined to preserve Isabella's story for a wider audience. The attention carried weight. State leaders, moved by the long fight for justice, began discussing new funding for forensic labs. The goal was clear: to expand capacity, to shorten the backlog of untested evidence, and to give other families a chance at closure before decades passed. Cold case units across New Mexico were ordered to re-examine files, searching for forgotten evidence that could benefit from the same advanced technology that had solved Isabella's case. At the same time, the story found its way into classrooms and community forums. High school students in Albuquerque learned not only about DNA and genealogy, but about the importance of persistence and advocacy for victims. Parents attended meetings about safety, resilience, and the way science could serve justice even when time tried to bury the truth. Carmen and Diego, though still grieving, sometimes spoke at these gatherings, reminding others that a voice once silenced could still echo through determination and care. The cultural impact stretched far. Isabella's name became a symbol of both tragedy and perseverance, her case cited in discussions about criminal justice reform and forensic advancements. For many, her story was not just about a crime, but about the power of memory, science, and community to eventually uncover the truth. Yet even as the nation looked on, One final question remained in the hearts of those closest to her. How would Isabella herself be remembered? Not just as a victim, but as a young girl who once laughed, dreamed, and left behind a light that could never truly fade. 17 years after that summer evening in 2007, Carmen and Diego returned to the banks of the Rio Grande. The sun was setting slowly, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. It was the same place where Isabella's truck had once been found. The same river that had carried so much fear and silence. But this time they came not in panic or in dread, but with the heavy weight of truth finally uncovered. Carmen stood quietly, her hands folded, her eyes locked on the water. For years she had imagined this moment, and yet it still felt unreal. Beside her, Diego placed a small sketchbook on the ground, one that Isabella had left unfinished on her desk all those years ago. It was his way of returning a piece of her back to the place where her story had changed forever. The river whispered softly against the rocks, a reminder of both the beginning and the end. What began as a nightmare of unanswered questions had ended in a truth that came too late, but still came. Technology had given Isabella her voice. Persistence had carried her memory through years of silence. Accountability had forced a system to admit its limits and learn its lessons. And though Miguel Herrera escaped the trial that should have held him to account, the one thing he could never erase was the truth left behind beneath Isabella's fingernails. She had fought back, and in the end, her fight had brought him to light. The community that once trembled now carried her name in vigils, in classrooms, and in reforms that would touch future generations. And for Carmen and Diego, standing on that riverbank, there was grief that would never fade, but also a cold kind of justice that no longer allowed her story to vanish into the shadows. Isabella's voice was no longer silent. If you are still here with me, still watching until this final moment, then this story deserves your like and subscribe. Turn on the bell icon so you never miss the stories we uncover here on Unscripted Tales. Please help me reach 5,000 likes on this story, because that is the target set from my mother for you. And it costs nothing but support. And tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this cold case story, because your words keep these memories alive.